All right, you're watching M Live NTV with me, Ibrahim Karanja, and we continue with our conversation with our panelists. The conversation based on the just concluded Africa Climate Summit that was held at the KICC. And we are asking whether it delivered or under-delivered on your expectations. That is a very personal opinion because each and every person has got a very different view of what came out of that particular summit. But before we get into our conversation, just to bring context, there was this story which we ran last night on expectations of the summit, and that the world now waits to see whether African countries are determined to wield more global influence and bring in more financing and support for climate action in line with the commitments in the Nairobi Declaration. Several stakeholders have criticized the summit, saying it did not meet expectations because it overpromised but seriously under-delivered. This, according to the critics, means that Africa will be going to COP28 with a weak position. Let's have a look at that story.
After 3 days of intense discussions by more than 20 heads of state and government representatives, it is now evident that the first African Climate Summit has taken a leap of faith and is now seeking to assert a stronger voice on global climate challenges, which it contributes the list to.
At the summit, our shared understanding became clear that Africa is not only the cradle of humanity, it is indeed the future, and that we are the last frontier of untapped potential.
But as the heads of state celebrated a successful outcome of the summit, criticism has started pouring in, many feeling that what the summit set out to do is not what was delivered.
There is also no strong call for historical polluters to be able to take responsibility and allocate resources in loss and damage fund, and also there's no strong commitment for adaptation.
Our northern counterparts have promised and they've not fulfilled their promises. And the other challenge also that we see, and this came out also in the summit, is that we are getting announcements, piecemeal announcements and commitments in terms of money. Like, for instance, we had an announcement from the US about them supporting particular adaptation initiatives. We are saying that these announcements, we do not want distractions. The commitment still stands, and we want to make sure that we continue the discussions in the multilateral way.
On his part, President William Ruto says the declaration will help put systems in place for the African region and drive the African agenda.
We also made it clear that we are aware of the unjust configuration of multilateral institutional frameworks that perpetually place African nations on the back foot through costly financing, which plunge our economies into debt trap and deny them resources needed to mitigate and adapt in response to climate change, invest in energy transition, and facilitate industrialization to create jobs and wealth.
Some of the experts questioned the involvement of the global North climate leaders in what was purely an African summit, prompting claims of hijacking the summit by some of the Western top polluters, allegations that Kenya, as the host, vehemently denied.
African leaders are hopeful that the signing of the Nairobi Declaration is a step in the right direction to see the continent rise as it targets to increase Africa's renewable clean energy at a more cost-effective capacity while creating green opportunities for the youth. On the other hand, some believe more still needs to be done to ensure the global north takes responsibility. Helen Aura, NTV.
Well, thank you, Helen. And purely from that story, you have had the concern that the global north might have hijacked the summit, and that some of the recommendations, though they appear flowery, are only meant to benefit the global north. Talk about matters carbon credit. Look at these are things which people are saying will only benefit the global north. Do you feel that those who are saying that the global north indeed hijacked the function found ways of sneaking in agenda that is only there, for them to benefit more and not the global south, is warranted?
Ibrahim, I respect the comments of our colleagues, and indeed, probably one or here, we did get everything on the plate. I want to, and this is my school of thought, I want to reiterate that this was not a negotiation meeting. This was not UNFCCC meeting, whereby you are given a chance to say something, is recorded, and then a declaration of 196 countries come together and say this is what we have done. This was not a negotiation meeting. So if you know that, then this is more of a political meeting, more of a policy dialogue meeting, more of raising awareness meeting, more of negotiating and creating critical mass, so that as we go to the negotiation table, we are well staffed with information. But going back to the issue of what was on the table, I want to reiterate that more than 80% of Africa uses biomass. What that means is that, like in Kenya, we use more than 30 million cubic meters of wood to provide for firewood, to provide for charcoal. 84% of that charcoal comes to city centers. What I'm seeing here is that we still have a long way to go in energy poverty. And I think this is across Africa.
Sure.
So what we are looking at is, did they talk to that? And when we talk about tuning to renewable energy, I think there was an effort to do that. But when you look at energy, also look at issues around health. If our clinics do not have electricity, it means the vaccines are not cooled. It means you cannot go to hospital any time of the day. It means that in the rural area, you cannot access some of the facilities in terms of clinic. So I feel that, first of all, we need to understand what the meeting was for. And from there, we see what we said versus what we got. If somebody was saying, like, I think one of the countries, and I think it's Germany, or forgive me for that, they have pushed a debt of about, I think, 65 million US dollars. What that means is that what the pronouncement we did at the opening gave birth to something. Can we first of all take that, then go back to see? And I think one of the panelists, and most of the panelists, talked about our issue around nationally determined contributions. We have promised to cut down 32% of our emissions by 2030, equivalent to around 143 million tons of carbon dioxide. We have only managed to do 13%. The rest, we need money. The thing is, and was said, is about technology transfer. We need technology transfer to do all this transformation around energy access, around issues around technology. We need that technology. Technology is not cheap. There was an effort to do that. So we must look at this meeting as a meeting of creating critical mass. And I think fairly it was succeeded. What I feel should have been the biggest thing is finance. I felt that there was no much effort to get everybody on board, and especially the northern people who came. We didn't get a good share of finances. And I agree with my colleagues who have just mentioned that we didn't get much money. This is the problem. Climate change is about poverty. Climate change is lack of money. Climate change is that money is not there to do what we want to do and when we want to do it.
Yet in previous summits, Philip.
No, I just wanted to add on this issue of was it a good thing to have leaders from the rest of the world?
Global, yeah, from the rest of the world that seeming to have hijacked our summit.
There are different ways to look at it, but I think from a climate science perspective, it is very important because the latest IPCC report, the 6th assessment report, shows that Africa is warming much faster than the rest of the world. Number two, we've just published an assessment for climate change and pollution in Africa, which shows that even if Africa was to go to zero emission right now, they will still suffer the consequences of climate change, because the largest share of the impact on climate change in Africa is actually from emissions outside the continent, not within the continent. So it's important that if you're talking about climate change in Africa, you cannot talk about climate change in Africa without having a conversation with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is contributing largely to the climate impact in Africa. And also I wanted to say something again linked to the NDCs that we talked about, the nationally determined contribution. From the African assessment on pollution and climate change, it actually shows that if African countries took some of the measures that are already committed to by themselves in the NDCs, you will also have local benefit within Africa. So some of our modeling actually shows that there'll be huge influence around rainfall patterns, especially in Central and West Africa. And we know, of course, Central and West Africa is a very important region when it comes to climate action, because that's where we have the Congo Basin rainforest, and that's quite a big carbon sink. So it's important, I think from a climate science perspective, it was right to have the rest of the world come to Nairobi to listen to the African leaders talk about climate. I mean, from a political side and other things, maybe people would have different views, and that's also fine.
Listening, Philip, is one thing. Them coming to listen to the summit, because most of this comes from, most of the Africa reels from the impact of what actually happens from the rest of the world, is one thing. But then again, the concerns that what was, at the end of the day, the resolution was something that seemed to have been pushed by them and not really as a solution for Africans, is what is now a concern.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how that process went about. What I know is that, we had several leaders come in, and most of them made some commitments around areas where they would like to see cooperation, because at the end of the day, it's about international cooperation. John talked about Germany. I see Germany committed to a debt swap with Kenya of 60 million euro. A debt swap just simply means that they would potentially write off that debt, with the country committing to use that money for nature conservation or for climate action. And I think that's one example which we can see that was positive. I think the COP28 president was here. I think he also made some commitments around, addressing concerns around climate and security. That's one of the areas where we have knowledge gaps right now. The fact that, with a warmer world, we'll have more conflicts, we'll have more displacement of communities, and we're already seeing that happening in the Sahelian belt, for example. If you look through the Sahelian belt, we are seeing on average much more increase around displacement. We are seeing a lot of conflict between pastoral communities and crop producing communities, in places like Nigeria, Cameroon, and so on. So how do you then bring all this together? You cannot bring all this together if you don't have a conversation with the rest of the world, so that they know their role in it, and then of course make sure that you have a development cooperation, or a cooperation that helps you work together to leverage on particularly technology. I think just to say an example, again, I saw a commitment around green hydrogen. We don't have technologies in this continent for green hydrogen production, but you can invest in capacity to bring up expertise and technology, and we've done it for geothermal, for example. So it's possible, and that is where this is important to bring this these other countries.
Fair enough. Well, fair enough. Fadel, having given the summit a thumbs down, perhaps you buy into that thought that it had been hijacked by the West, the rest of the world, who, according to Philip, and rightly so, should have come to listen. But many are saying the resolutions were actually sort of triggered by the West and not Africans. Maybe it's what also informed the swapping of food sovereignty to food security. What are your thoughts?
Well, I said this before the summit. I said we want to invite the world to come witness our bold ambition, not to come veto our ambitions and impose the framing for the summit. So I'll give you a little bit of context. 2 weeks before the summit, in Addis, the AMCEN conference took place, which is the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, where a lot of the unity around climate change issues are typically discussed, including a discussion of what would become the Nairobi Declaration. And there was a lot of logistical difficulties, to put it this way, in the sense that the draft declaration didn't actually arrive to the negotiators, to the ministers, until almost the very last minute. So there's very little time to actually see the draft declaration. And the process of the discussion really brought up all the issues that we should have seen in the declaration on food sovereignty as opposed to food security, on leveraging our strategic minerals for African industrialization with regional cooperation, building supply chains across the continent to create and retain value on the continent. All of that was very encouraging. And that's an African Union meeting. And this is an African Union summit hosted by Kenya. So we would expect all of that discussion and strong statements that came out of AMCEN. All the African ministers were there.
Are they sure?
To be visible in the declaration. When we come to Nairobi, we don't know what happened. Right? The majority of all of that rich discussion and statements was left out. So it leaves you wondering, you know, the presence of the global north and the nudging and the incentives and the framing, what impact it had on our African Climate Summit here in Nairobi. So this is something that we need to be aware of, because this is not COP, this is not an international summit where everybody has a voice and you have to negotiate and push back. This was our opportunity to say, this is who we are, this is what we want, and let the world hear it. They may disagree with it, they may push back, but at least we say what we want for ourselves and we unite behind that vision. And then when you see, you know, some of the, you know, false solutions that are inserted in our declaration, like carbon markets you mentioned earlier, it's given to us as one of the, you know, few climate finance solutions left on the table, when it's actually a distraction. Because what carbon markets are essentially a permit to continue pollution.
Sure.
Because you pay for it and continue pollution. Yes, it raises the cost of doing business, but we're talking about companies that have massive market power. They can pass on the cost of doing business to their customers. Many of their customers are on this continent, by the way, so end up paying for it. So what does carbon markets does? It risks displacing communities on this continent, the most vulnerable communities, and it continues it doesn't reduce global emissions. There's no cap. There's like this infinite supply of pollution permits, and we call that a climate fine, and we get crumbs for it, and we end up paying for it indirectly.
So is there room, before I go to Taha, is there room, because I believe what the Nairobi Declaration is what Africa will present at COP28. So is there room in between to incorporate the summit that happened 2 weeks prior? Because according to you, the resolutions from that particular conference was stronger than the Nairobi declarations, or is it all lost?
Of course, there's always time. We're not locked into the Nairobi Declaration, and we don't have to continue accepting false solutions and distractions. Even climate finance, even the commitments that we see in, you know, from Europe on green hydrogen and everything. Yes, transfer of technology, investment in green hydrogen, as long as it's small to medium scale in countries that actually have water resources, because it's very water intensive. Absolutely, great idea, but what does that green hydrogen production going to feed into? Is it going to feed into transformation of our economies to build resilience, or is it going to feed into the structural traps? So for example, we invest in green hydrogen to produce fertilizers, which is one of the proposals. Are we using those fertilizers to produce corn and wheat for our food sovereignty, or to feed into producing cash crops for exports to the rest of the world? That's a huge difference in terms of the impact of billions of dollars of energy investment, and it's sold to us as a green transition, but it's feeding into an economic trap for the continent. So we have to be very careful, and it's our responsibility to be alert and to be selective. You say, thank you very much for the investment, but this is not contributing to our development. This is keeping us in the same structural traps. We would like to push back, redirect this investment for things that transform the continent on the climate front, on the development front, and alert our partners internationally, whether it's technical assistance, financial contribution, or private foreign direct investment. We set the agenda on our terms and find partners to meet our vision.
Taha, as you are listening to the various groups bring in their resolutions or their commitment at the closure of the summit, there was that very interesting element of the youth. You run a platform that largely engages the youth and Gen Z. Looking at it from the background of your platform and the message that were communicated, which the rest of the panelists, aside from Kioli, are saying it is communications that sort of a repeat of what we've seen in previous conferences, are not resolute enough. How do you bring in the population, the populace that you target, to effect the Nairobi Declaration?
I think for youth, the situation is the stakes are incredibly high from their perspective. We cannot talk about climate resilience, climate change, climate mitigation without talking about youth. I think a lot of the projects we saw take place in northern Kenya, across the continent, we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about saving our planet, but we don't speak enough about the communities that are involved. And in Africa, that is largely youth. In the global south, that's largely youth. So the stakes are incredibly high. I think from a young person's perspective, a lot was said. They were participating. Now the question is, what's the action that's going to take place? From their perspective, from our perspective, from the youth's perspective, what really matters is how can these declarations lead to better livelihoods for them, for this next generation? And how can the green transition contribute to that? We often ask young people to find solutions, and often for free, without giving them the skills, without giving them the tools. And here I'm just talking about at a global level. This isn't just here. This is at a global level. And I think if we are to find a solution that is long-term, that is sustainable, the youth will be part of it. They need to be included, and they need to be given the tools and the forums to do so. One concrete example, which I thought was very interesting, was the commitment to fund youth ecopreneurship, or entrepreneurship that works with nature rather than against it. Giving young people the skills, giving young people the financing. $1 billion committed. Now the question, and youth demand accountability of that. And this has to happen at scale, and it has to happen quickly. So on behalf of the young people, my request would be, okay, continue to include them in the discussions. Let's also make sure that it is diverse youth that are represented. So we're trying to do that at COP, at the different summits that are taking place around the world. Let's make sure that it's the northern Kenyan that is included. Let's make sure that it is the youth from Burundi. Let's make sure that it is not just from the capitals. And let's make sure they're trained for it. And then, of course, let's make sure that the funds are appropriately dispersed, because the example of the ecopreneurship, that could be transformative. But now that $1 billion has to be dispersed and dispersed quickly.
Kelly, you are talking about the deals. That on the positives, let's look at what the country and the continent has been able to strike from the climate summit. You mentioned, for instance, what Germany swapped in debt with Kenya. That is to a tune of 60 million euros. And the very many other deals that came out from that particular summit, which the Business Daily has really captured in depth. But then again, the concern would be, these are not the first deals or the first pledges or the first promises we have seen as far as climate action goes. Copenhagen, the pledge to have up to a tune of $100 billion towards climate action has never been met. So what then gives you hope that what has been pledged in this particular summit, what has been promised or committed in this particular summit, is going to see the light of day?
The Nairobi Declaration, to me, has several components, some positive, some negative. I feel that the issue of finance is still a big problem in Africa. And that's why, even as we talk about the issue of carbon credits, we have two different schools of thought. There's a school of thought that this is a false solution. There's a school of thought that this could be a transitional solution as we get permanent solutions. There was an effort of His Excellency the President of Republic of Kenya and other leaders to turn the narrative that Africa should be the one to determine the cost of the carbon credits. Remember, this is like you rearing a goat, you rearing your cow, and you take it to the market, and instead of telling the buyer your price, you ask the buyer, how much will you buy? This is impossible. We need to say Africa will never be the same again. We own these carbon credits, we own our land, we own our trees, we own our soil, and we own this product that is called carbon credits. Let's sit on the table and say $40 per ton is not enough. It's not even a drop in the ocean. Sure. It's a drop in the ocean. That aside, I feel that the issue around negotiation has been amplified. I feel that the African leaders still have a window at the African negotiation block. They go a week before the COP meetings in Dubai. This push will catapult them, if I would use that, to engage further and to realize that we are endangered species in Africa, to realize that we hold Africa and Africa is ours, that we can do something that is based in Africa. One of the things I never saw coming out clearly is the issue of private sector involvement. Ibrahim, climate change cannot be dealt by scientists, climate experts like us, and governments. Private sector hold a very key role, especially in energy access. And I'm talking about energy clean cookstoves. I'm talking about renewable energy, specifically solar. We see, and if Kenya is anything to go by, very cheap solar equipment from some countries I don't want to mention. When the government of Kenya gives them VAT exemption, they don't pass that exemption to the customers. Okay? They don't make it possible to get solar equipment cheaply. They don't bring very good material. And I also accuse our regulators for allowing cheap material and doesn't work. So what happens? Solar is not working, solar becomes expensive, and this private sector continue becoming rich. We need to say private sector, be a genuine enabler towards energy access in Kenya, be a genuine enabler towards energy access in Africa, so that the 600 billion Dr. Osano, million people in Africa, Dr. Osano mentioned, we will have access to clean renewable energy, we'll have connectivity, we'll charge their computers, their phones, will amplify their markets in terms of electricity, because the private sector was a genuine enabler. This did not come out very, very powerfully in the conference.
Philip, let's go to renewable energy. And there's a very ambitious, I would call it ambitious plan to have an increase of up to 300 gigawatts from 55 gigawatts right now in 8 years. How do we have a roadmap? How do we achieve this?
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, everything is possible. When there's commitment, there's political will, there's capital. One is technology, and we've talked a lot about that. I mean, we have to build up the technology so that it provides for the possibility to achieve it. Number two is the expertise. I talked earlier before about that you know, you need to train more people, a workforce that would be able to fit into that, you know, that renewable energy ecosystem. And I think here, I just really wanted to point out the point we brought about the youth. Median age for African youth right now is 19 years. And I think if there's anything else that African leaders should think about when they think about climate action, is creating opportunities for the youth. And then number three is infrastructure. And that's the other part which links to what Mr. Kioli talked about, because infrastructure, governments alone do not have the flexibility and the budget to invest in massive infrastructure. We've talked about the debt challenge and so on. So having some models around public-private partnership will be very critical. So you need private sector there. But I also wanted to point out that even without looking at, even with the current energy capability that we have, I think it's important for me to just make sure that we remind ourselves of the basics. You know, the 900 million people that lack clean cooking. We have been working with some communities in Mukuru, and again I say it's very important for women because they have to cook. They cook with charcoal, sometimes with, you know, firewood and so on. And we were looking at just pollution levels when they're cooking with firewood, and you realize that between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. you have very high pollution levels of what we call particulate matter. And so for us to look at solutions that provide for, it's not just a global thing, because when you tackle air pollution, you're also contributing seriously to reducing the health burden that comes with respiratory illnesses. And I think that's the part that we really want to emphasize, particularly for policymakers, that when we talk about climate and air pollution action, it's not just that we are doing it for the rest of the world. The largest benefit will come to us. If you look at one of the things I'm happy about with the Nairobi Declaration is attention to cities. attention to cities is very strongly linked, of course, to creating opportunities for youth, but it helps us link issues like waste management. You know, a large share of emissions that cause both climate change and air pollution is coming from how we manage our waste. When we burn tires or we burn, you know, when you burn our waste, it creates pollution, it creates emission. The part I also like linking to the youth is opportunities for innovation, and we saw, I think, it was quite a powerful statement for the president to drive the electric car, you know, when he was coming to the Youth Summit. I think it was a message to say that actually this is the future. So how do we go through our training systems, our curriculum system, to make sure that the engineers that we're training are trained for that, they become the future workforce, not just for this region actually, that can actually work globally anywhere. So we become front runners. So then technology becomes very important. And lastly, I also wanted to point out, because again, people do ask why this thing is important. Even in Kenya, some of the more areas where we really feel that we feel proud of. One is athletics. I want to mention athletics because now we are seeing air pollution, higher temperatures affecting performance of athletes. Most of you must have watched about 2 weeks ago when we had the World Championship in Budapest. And of course, the expectation for Kenya to win marathon was, I think people felt dampened because we didn't see Kenyans winning the marathon race. And when the athletes were interviewed, they said actually, it was actually the heat was just too much.
Too much, sure.
And we're seeing that happening a lot. So we have a program that we're working with Athletics Kenya and the United Nations Environment Program to just try to highlight some of these unseen impacts of climate and air pollution on day-to-day activities. Yeah.
When we come back, we'll be getting to get comments from the other three on renewable energy before we move to the other concern. But my director, John Milimo, is telling me it's time for yet another break here on AM Live. Don't go too far. The conversation continues on the other side of the break.
Pre-primary one, she was starting to get issues with hearing in class. She could actually say, I can't hear the teacher. Or when you talk to her, you notice she's not hearing. And initially I thought she was just being cheeky or naughty. I mean, she's a small girl. Yeah.
Child's immunity is not very well developed, so it is not surprising that they may get recurrent viral infections. However, if these infections are coming with now high fevers, if the child is also getting ear complications like ear pain or ear infections, it means that whatever is happening is also affecting the ears. So the adenoids, where they're situated, actually will affect both, because naturally human beings are supposed to breathe through the nose. But now when the adenoid enlarges, it obstructs the passage for breathing. There's always a risk with self-medication. And that is because, first of all, we may not be treating the right thing. And the second thing is, some of the medicines can actually be harmful to the child.
Well, no country should ever have to choose between development aspirations and climate actions. That is the rallying call from the Nairobi Declaration that was that came out of the African Climate Summit that was being held here at the KICC. And we are still breaking down that declaration and what it means for Africa moving forward, and also for the world, not only for Africa, because some of the commitments made in that particular declaration are commitments that require all of us to, take part and make sure that we are involved in climate action. And we are speaking about renewable energy for them, and I call it an ambitious project by the African continent. This is more than, it's actually 6 times, to increase 6 times the gigawatts, that from 55 to 300 in 8 years. So what is the journey? What is the roadmap?
Well, the commitment to leapfrog into a renewable energy system is wonderful, but renewable energy can also recreate structural problems, economic structural problems. I'll give you an example. Green hydrogen, for example, is huge commitments from Europe all over the continent, especially in North Africa. Now, green hydrogen is very important to understand what the technology is. It requires about 28 liters of fresh water, clean water, to produce 1 liter of hydrogen. So it's very water intensive. So to commit those investments in a country like Tunisia or a country like Namibia that experiences severe droughts, where there isn't enough water to drink, there isn't enough water to irrigate agriculture for our food production, it's not reasonable to commit those investments, especially when the hydrogen is not for local consumption. It's hydrogen for exports to be consumed in Europe. And then one of the byproducts of green hydrogen is, what in a country that doesn't have water, is water desalination, which creates a lot of toxic brine, the salt basically that remains, that's basically dumped back in the ocean, raises the salinity of the water and raises the temperature and destroys the ecosystem over time. So this is not worth calling that green energy production when it's not even for African use, it's for exports. The Namibia case, it's interesting because they say, oh, yes, water desalination, green electricity, but it's funny for manufacturing. Green manufacturing on the continent, great, but then look at the details. What kind of manufacturing? Is it high value added manufacturing, or is it locking us into assembly line manufacturing to be exported? So the devil is in the detail, as they say. So we're on board with cleaning the electricity system, delivering electricity to the African people, but not for using this green energy transformation to feed into existing pathways for exporting to Europe. We need to deliver electricity on the continent. The other aspect of green energy transformation on the continent, are we going to continue to be consumers of technology, whereby we actually borrow money to import the solar panels, the wind turbines, and the technology, and then continue to be entrapped in a debt trap? I'll give you one example that's very dangerous to replicate on the continent. One of the largest solar farms on the continent is in Egypt. It was funded through a loan, a European loan, to 12 European companies to build the infrastructure, produce clean energy for Egyptian consumers, but selling it at a premium to Egyptian consumers and extracting the profits to be repatriated to Europe, not in Egyptian pounds, but with a fixed exchange rate with the dollar. So no matter what happens to the Egyptian exchange rate, they are guaranteed their profits at a premium. And then what happens when those solar panels, expire after 25 years and become obsolete? We get a new loan to rebuild the infrastructure and continue the extraction. And Egyptian consumers are essentially importing green energy from European companies, even though it's produced on their own soil.
For them, listening to you on your reaction from the Nairobi Declaration, sounds too gloomy. Is there anything positive from it that you've picked?
Well, I should explain why is it. I think it's too gloomy, or my reaction's too gloomy, because I'm trying to be alert to all the structural weaknesses and deficiencies that we experienced in the past that got us into this position, and trying to avoid reproducing the same traps in the name of a green transition and all of that. So the positive thing that comes out of this whole process is that we finally have an African climate summit. We finally have our leaders aligning the approach to climate and development. We have our leaders aware that we operate in a global financial architecture that must be transformed, right? So this is all positive. We're finally touching the nerve system, right? That's getting us there. And when we talk about the global financial architecture, yes, we're moving in the right direction. Yes, we're pointing to the right issues, but we're still operating sort of at the surface. And here's what I mean. We see a lot of the focus is on lowering the cost of capital, restructuring debt, but we're not talking about transforming the system as opposed to just giving our Africans more voice in the G20 and the IMF system. The Bretton Woods system, the IMF and the World Bank financial architecture that dominates the world, was created in 1944 when Africa was still colonized. There was a little bit of African presence, but not really independent countries with a voice in that process. So this is a financial architecture, an international trade architecture that was not designed by us, was not designed for us. It's not going to be the financial architecture that will save us today. So we want our leaders to continue pushing on this front, to insist on undoing the structures that are exactly colonial. They were not designed to build Africa and develop Africa. They were designed to rebuild Europe and to protect the interest of the United States and Europe at the time.
Taha, your reaction to the ambition to increase renewable energy, production of renewable energy?
No, absolutely. The ambition is there, and it's exciting, and it's a move in the right direction. I definitely echo what the other panelists have said in terms of being alert to the potential structural pitfalls. That it is not something that is structurally regrettable in 20-25 years, but it's something that's, if it can be leveraged, particularly given the resources here, fantastic.
And Philip mentioned something very interesting about exporting the human capital from Africa, trading them to meet the needs of this declaration, and then at the end of the day getting them to a position of actually exporting human capital. You had an addition to it.
Yeah, there's so much energy here. We saw that at the Youth Summit, and the President not just acknowledged this, but reiterated it. There's so much energy, there's so much talent. We're talking about over 25% of the global talent pool coming out of here in the future. So this is going to be the powerhouse of human capital. Now the question is, it needs to be able to compete globally, and as was mentioned, a bit like in manufacturing, it has to go up the value chain. And for that, we need it to be skilled, we need it to have confidence, we need the interpersonal, the soft skills to be developed, because there's so much going for it. And if that happens, we know that, for example, Germany has made a request for youth in order to fill its gaps. For the first year, there are more people leaving the workforce in France than entering it. So there is a clear need. Now the question is, again, how can we provide the structure for this next generation to fulfill its potential, and as a result, drive the continent forward? And it goes hand in hand. Can we leverage this opportunity, which is the green transition, to kind of restart the system for this new generation?
Clearly, what Fadel is saying, and it's interesting that we're having the two of you on the same panel. Fadel is saying it's important that Africa held the summit, but he's also being cautious, he's being alert, so that things that have historically affected the continent in terms of climate change and climate action do not happen again. You're looking at all the positives from the climate summit. From what he's saying, that he is just being alert, he's looking at the solutions that were that the continent came to yesterday as solutions that would largely benefit the West. How then do we turn them around to make sure that the likes of Fadel, who are concerned that this did not meet our expectations, are satisfied?
Yeah, I think they always say don't go to the grocery with an empty stomach. And Africa already has an empty stomach. Africa is poor. So there are always this dangling of carrots ahead of the horse. And it comes in terms of finance. I'm in the school of thought that we are not ready for hydrogen. I'm in the school of thought that we are not ready for nuclear. I'm in the school of thought that it's time for Africa to invest in solar. It has worked. I'm in the school of thought that we need to turn down that 80% of our use of biomass to a renewable energy, or at least some sort of energy that is good. And one of the solutions that is very clear is, can we have money towards quick wins? Can we avoid situations where somebody is holding a dangling carrot about hydrogen, which will take like 20 years to come? Somebody is holding a carrot on nuclear energy, which will take at least 30 years to happen in Kenya. Let me tell you the truth. We have the potential of renewable energy in Kenya on solar, geothermal, wind, and we should invest in quick wins. We are energy poor. We need to invest in the quick wins. Remember, we are promised as a country to go in a low carbon development pathway. In the Climate Change Act of 2016, in the National Climate Change Action Plan, in the Paris Agreement, which was promulgated by Kenya in 2016 as part of our constitution. What that means is that we need to move in a certain way, and that is low carbon pathway. So if we can put some more money in what is very clear, and I agree with my other panelists that there are these solutions that are far-fetched. They need more money, they need more time, but there are clear guidelines like solar, wind, geothermal. Why don't you put money there so that we move on to the next level? Yeah.
Well, there are those who are saying that also while pushing for our climate, or pushing for our position, we are being too soft. Yesterday I hosted a panel of members of parliament, and one of them actually said it's about time Africa and African leaders set their foot on the ground, that look, the rest of the world, we are in this mess because of you, point blank, and if you're not going to implement some of our recommendations, including trading debt for nature, then we will also not take part, let's even abstain from attending COP28 where they see Africa is resolute. Would that be an option?
I think leaders worldwide were shocked by the speech of His Excellency the President in front of the northern leaders who are there. And pronouncing ourselves, yes, we are energy poor, yes, we are climate change stricken, yes, we don't have money, but there are these rules we want to put on the table. We want to say an electric car can be assembled in Africa, 100%. We are saying that all these minerals come from Africa. We are no longer going to export the minerals as they are. We want you to come and manufacture in Kenya. If we do this, one of the things that is going to happen, we are going to be empowered economically. If we're in control of our energy, tell me the country that is in control of its energy that is not sustainable. That is a target that I saw at least the President of the Republic of Kenya pushing. But all the noises should increase towards getting finance, even getting the ambition higher. We are not even half the ambition, even in this conference. So any noise that is going to put more food on the table, any noise that is going to put more resources on the table is welcome, because we are suffering, we have an empty stomach, Africa is energy poor, Africa is financially poor, so we need all the resources to be put on the table, and if possible, to have a conclusive COP28 loss and damage basket, not only implemented, but populated with money, so that we can say the 2.5 million of livestock that died in the last 2 years in Kenya can be compensated. That is when we'll have reason for my mother in Kitui, for my mother in Pokot, for my mother in Turkana to have a reason to smile, because her bank account has been restored. Livestock is not just animals, it's a bank account of a pastoralist. And this was washed away last year by the drought that happened in Kenya. Can we do something to ensure that there's a compensation? That rule of common but differentiated responsibility will never change. And this started in 1992. It will mutate, but it will never change. The polluter must pay.
The polluter must pay.
Yes.
We understand the fact that UN Secretary General Guterres was present. Then there are the resolutions that are made at the African Climate Summit, and there is the expected reception by the rest of the world. What is your prediction in terms of the expected reception, and how then we are going to have what was concluded upon, what was agreed upon, implemented?
So I go back to my first point, which is that every country has made some commitments on climate action under what's called nationally determined contribution. So every other country in the world will look at the declaration out of Nairobi and say, what does it mean
to us?
To us, first within our own climate action ambition, but also globally. So for regions, for example, like the EU, which has the EU as a bloc has a one nationally determined contribution, NDC. They will look what does it mean in terms of our trade. There were issues about trade, for example, and so on. So that's important. Number two, I think countries would look at opportunities. And I think when it comes to opportunities, and when you talk about the workforce, for example, it's also important for us to not be limited by seeing this as an African versus North. Africa is vulnerable, yes, but the many other regions in the world, the small island states are very vulnerable. The countries in Southeast Asia are very vulnerable. Countries in Latin America are more or less facing the same challenge African countries are facing. So the idea to then bring this forward also to this block of countries that actually collectively are actually facing the same mounting problems of debt, mounting problem of high vulnerability, and then canvas that as part of the negotiations. And number three, I think I wanted to, because you point about the fact the UN Secretary General was here, and I want to connect that to what Fadel is talking about, the structural issues. We are seeing a silent transformation, and that silent transformation is coming in the way we understand our economic system. So one of the things that have been happening in Nairobi, separate from, as part of the large activities, is actually the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics has been hosting African governments that work on statistics to train them in terms of understanding new measures of economic progress. So we know that our economic progress is measured as part of the GDP, but the GDP, unfortunately, doesn't signal to us when we are deteriorating the environment. So there are new measures that are coming in called Inclusive Wealth Index that actually also takes into account the cost of economic progress. We have not done that before, and that's transformation, and the UN has endorsed this because it is being managed under the UN systems of statistical accounts. So it is some of this little progress that we are seeing that for me is making it positive. And I wanted to conclude because it's probably difficult for people to understand where the journey has come from. Just way back in 1984, the UN created a commission, the World Commission on Environment and Development, that coined the whole concept of sustainable development. The commission sat for 4 years until 1987. So some of these processes are very incremental, and people might feel that nothing is happening, but progress does happen, but it does happen slowly.
Progress does happen, but it does happen slowly. Fadel, that is the African leaders who spoke. That is the African continent that spoke yesterday. Then again, there is the reception of that particular declaration by the rest of the world. From where you sit, how would you expect then the rest of the world to treat the declaration that came yesterday, especially when the voice is as loud as Kioli is saying that the continent has spoken and has spoken so loudly?
Well, I'll take one point, which is one of the major sources of this climate change, which is fossil fuels, right? We do have a mention of fossil fuels in the declaration, but lacked the opportunity to lead the world in a very clear message to the historic polluters on phasing out fossil fuels. Because the science is very clear. From UNEP reports, from the IPCC reports, it's very clear that we have to, number one, stop adding new fossil fuel infrastructure globally, and the North American continent is responsible for adding 80% of the new infrastructure. We're talking about, we're adding new fossil fuel infrastructure at the tune of $500 billion per year, up to $1 trillion per year of new infrastructure that will keep locking us into that. A lot of it is on this continent too, because of the energy crisis in Europe and the dash for gas and all that. Number two, what the science is clearly telling us. Stop adding infrastructure and design a rapid plan for phase out of existing fossil fuel infrastructure with just transition for countries that depend on fossil fuels for their own economy, especially on this continent, and for countries that depend on fossil fuels as a source of revenues for exports. And the good news is that there's an international effort called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative that started with Nobel laureates, scientists, faith groups from around the world. And now we finally have countries, sovereign countries, joining this call for the international community to sit down and negotiate a fossil fuel treaty that is just, that is equitable, and that's at the core of actually dealing with climate change. Everything else we're doing is helpful, transitioning to renewable energy, doing this, but if we don't have a clear statement from our continent and leading the world and sitting down and negotiating a phase out that's fair for African countries, that is transformational, we will be missing a tremendous opportunity, and eventually we'll have to face that reality. That fossil fuel treaty will be negotiated at some point. And we want Africans and the Global South to lead the effort because we're on the front lines. We didn't cause this damage, right? We're not responsible for climate change. We're only 4% of global emissions are Africans. That's the equivalent to Spain alone, right? So we should be the ones leading this. And yes, we touched on it in the Nairobi Declaration, but what a missed opportunity to tell the world that we're going to change the structures that caused this problem in the first place. That's ownership, that's leadership that we need to see in the weeks and months ahead from the African continent.
Taha, the way forward.
Investment, I'm reiterating what's been said here, investment, just investment. We talked about the carbon element just as an example, something that's priced here. If we talk about talent, let's make sure that they are equipped to be able to compete globally. But what's clear is that if there isn't sufficient investment, if I take the example, and there's this desire globally to rely on Africa's resources to protect us and to mitigate, if there isn't enough investment, there will not be enough into development, there will not be enough into education, there will not be enough into local communities, and it is very likely that society unravels. And when that happens, all bets are off. And so one has to price it justly, just coming back to this. One has to price it justly so that there is enough to go around and that we can all rise together.
Go ahead.
That we can all rise together, really. That investment into, and it cannot all happen in one go, that's for sure. So, we talk about a lack of connectivity, for example, that often comes up when we speak about, but what about those who don't have? I'd say if there's 800 million young people out there, and we can serve 100 million and help them already go up, they will rise the tide for the rest of us, or they will contribute to rising the tide for the rest of us. So, we have to start now, we have to go fast, and it does require, there's no option but to invest comprehensively by the global north into the region.
Well, clearly, we made these resolutions as a continent, but then again, there is the contribution of individual countries. When you're talking about increasing the capacity of renewable energy capacity, there is a contribution of each and every individual country in the African continent. And we have different capabilities, different strengths, different weaknesses. We need to strike a balance so that at the end of the day, what we agreed in the declaration is eventually met. Where do we find a balance? Because what Kenya has is not necessarily what Nigeria has.
I think Kenya has a potential of 3 sources of renewable energy. One is wind. 2 is geothermal, and of course hydro. And one of the key things I want to look at is how can Kenya also negotiate for its own people? As we negotiate for Africa, we need to know the potential in Kenya is unmatched in Africa. We need to realize that by the end of the day, we need to start shifting to talking about biomass energy. What do we do with it? Because lighting, we are almost sorted, but our people are still using firewood, 80%.
True.
So we need to look for that just transition. How can we deal with that permanently? As we go to Dubai, I want to encourage our negotiators, not only from Kenya, but worldwide, to look for those permanent solutions. Because we cannot continue talking about false solutions. What are those other additionalities that we can put on the table so that we have a mix, a blend of solutions that can return us to where we were before the agrarian revolution? Finally, we need to marshal ourselves to come back from Dubai with a new text of saying end to fossil fuel, not face down, facing out. And this is the language you want to see in Dubai. And finally, as a politician, we need to have bilaterals, country to country. Apart from the COP meetings, we need to have bilaterals that can benefit the country of Kenya. Africa must rise again.
Africa must rise again. And I'll come to you for your closing comments because we have only 4 minutes. We'll distribute it 1 minute to each of you. Let me start with you, Philip. The conference is done. We're now looking into the future. We're looking at COP28 in Dubai. We're looking at eventually having effective climate action, not dealing with the effects that we are dealing with today. What would you speak to the leadership of the African continent, the people of the African continent, and also the people in the rest of the world?
Very simple. I think from my side, I speak for the scientific community. We have a very clear roadmap. We had a meeting here of African scientists that are working and involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change process. We are starting the 7th assessment cycle. One of the special reports that's been commissioned, that will be commissioned already, will be a special report on climate and cities. So my message, of course, to the African leadership, and I think I just want to reiterate what President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea and President Kagame said, let's bring the science community to provide knowledge and advisory to the African policymakers on climate action.
Well, for the closing comments.
Closing comments.
Speaking to the leadership, to the very, targeted.
We talked about the science and all the issues. Let's talk about the reality of geopolitics and where we're moving forward. As you know, if we don't have a coherent, united African vision for ourselves, I guarantee you we're already part of somebody else's vision. And on the geopolitics, you have 3 major economic powers, the US, Europe, and China. And these are regions and blocks that have 100-year vision for themselves. And every country, every region has the right to have a vision for itself. And they will use their economic diplomacy, their incentives, to nudge everybody else in a position where they want to see them. Sure. And they have every right to do that. But it's also our right and our responsibility as Africans and our leaders to present a coherent vision for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be part of somebody else's vision. And this is the vision that the rest of the world had for us during colonial times and post-colonial times. We don't want that vision to be reproduced. How do they see us? They see us as the place for cheap raw materials. They see us as the place where they dump their industrial output, as a market for their output. They see us as the place for exotic tourist destination, low-cost destinations. And number 4, they see us as the place where they would outsource obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that they no longer need, and call that development and cooperation and assistance. Now, if that's the vision that they have for us for the next 100 years, we're going to be trapped in the same troubles. And no matter how much we sit down and negotiate, and so we have to have a clear vision of who we are, how we're able to reposition ourselves, not to dominate the world, but to rebalance the global economy and position ourselves on a path for sustainability, equity, justice, and prosperity for the continent and for the rest of the world.
Interesting or not, you've said how the rest of the world sees us. They see us as a dumping site. In other words, they see us as a place to take cheap raw materials, as a low-cost tourist destination, and so on and so forth. I hope then we are able to change the perspective from which they see us in the next couple of weeks and months, even as this climate action conversation continues. Let's have closing comments from you, Taha.
Thank you so much. From a youth perspective, it was incredibly encouraging seeing President Ruto there speaking very clearly that this is an opportunity to move young people from being perceived as a liability to an asset. This is true not only on the continent, this is true globally. And I mean that the African youth can be either a liability or an asset for our global economy. There are going to be trillions of dollars in unrealized revenue if there is a mismatch of skills which exists today, which is expanding year on year, if we're not able to fill that demand for talent, and African youth can provide it. However, if we do not do that, there are obviously challenges for the local economies, but there is going to be a migratory crisis and a humanitarian crisis such that has never been seen before, or is likely to have never been seen before. This is an opportunity, and I think if we're able to give them the tools, that's our only ask. We're not asking for power. We're not asking for a handout. All we're asking for are the tools for young people to fulfill their potential and live up to its promise.
Wow. Kioli.
I'm calling upon the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Climate Change. I'm calling upon the county governments of the Republic of Kenya to go and implement what they harvested during this week of the Africa Climate Summit. I'm also calling upon Africa, as you go to Dubai, if you're not in the table, you are part of the menu. Africa must negotiate in one voice as one Africa. Thank you for this opportunity.
Well, if Africa is not on the table, it is in the menu, or is it on the menu? That is according to Kioli, who's one of our panelists here. And thank you very much, gentlemen, for honoring our invitation to further dissect what has happened in the past 3 days at the KICC. And this dissecting will continue to happen within the Nation Media Group and across all our platforms, NTV, Daily Nation, Business Daily, Taifa Leo, Nation.Africa, and the very many other platforms that we have that we've been using to disseminate information to you. But I must say thank you to the panelists, John Kioli, the chairperson, Kenya Climate Change Working Group, who joined us very early in the morning, and thank you very much for your contribution. Taha Bawa, the co-founder and CEO of Goodwall. I'm told you're flying out today. Is it? Tomorrow. Enjoy the country. Like our president said, we have a park around, and the animals at points break free.
More than just a park. There's a lot here. Amazing.
We have Dr. Fadel Kaboub, the president, Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Thank you very much for joining us, not only today, but also early in the week to discuss this climate summit, as well as Dr. Philip Osano, the director, Stockholm Environment Institute of Africa. This is also the second time you're appearing this week, and we hope to tap into your knowledge and information in the next couple of weeks as we break down the Africa Climate Summit, even as we move again to COP28. So that is it from AM Live NTV. My name is Ibrahim Karanja. We have had an amazing team behind the scenes that was helping in making this a success, from our editor Dan Mwangi and the rest of the team, John Milimo. I can't mention all of them. It's just an amazing, stellar team here at NTV. It has been a pleasure. Your World is up next, and interestingly, it still continues with this conversation from Africa Climate Summit. So make sure you don't touch that dial.